Good morning and welcome. Thank you very much for coming here. I hope you didn't mind that rather ominous sounding music on the resilience panel. It's quite a threatening start to things. Before we start off, can I please have a show of hands of how many of you are from market infrastructures? Not very many. I don't know whether that's reassuring or comforting, given that we're discussing resilience of market infrastructures. So either you're worried about them or they're not worried about themselves, or both. To kick this off, I'm actually going to turn straight to another question for you, which will be put up on the screen behind me. You need to wait to answer until the clock starts ticking, but I want to ask you all the extent to which, or not the extent to which, but a yes or no question, so very simple, whether you believe that parallels can be drawn between the financial industry and other mission-critical industries like aviation, military, pharmaceutical, energy, in resiliency terms or not. So when the clock starts, you get to vote green for yes or red for no. There we go. This is also to test how many of you are awake, because we'll find out how many have answered the questions. A 100%. Goodness me. Okay, well, we'll see whether the panel agrees with you. So here today to discuss this with me, I've got three very distinguished panelists, all from the financial industry at present. But if I can start with Hannah. Hannah actually has a background in energy. She is the managing director of the UK's payment system regulator, a 6-month-old regulator. She's been there for approximately 15 months. Previously, she was at Ofgem, which is the UK gas and electricity regulator. And there she led the development and implementation of the regulatory framework. So it would be interesting to explore with Hannah the parallels between the two industries. Next, I have John from CLS. John has been at CLS since the very beginning, I believe. Before that, he was at Echo, which was acquired by CLS, and John has 30 years' experience in the banking industry. Next, I have Philip Innes, who's the global lead of market infrastructures, banks, and financial markets at IBM here in Singapore. He's worked at IBM for 17 years. Yes? So from this you can deduce that Hannah's the youngest on the panel, you see, because she hasn't given us her 30 or 17 years experience. And me as well, I would also add to that. He was formerly a trader. He worked in foreign exchange, fixed income and proprietary trading with Midland Bank and Nico, amongst others. So, well, John, I'm going to turn to you as the direct industry representative. 100% of the audience believe that there are lessons to be learnt in resiliency terms from other industries. Agree or disagree? You'd be bold to disagree.
I agree. I'm pleased that 100% of the audience agree as well. Absolutely, there are lessons to be learnt from other industries, whether it's around preparedness, planning, process execution, contingency, monitoring, and hopefully I'll bring to life some of those learnings in today's panel.
Thank you. Hannah?
I agree, and again, very pleased that that was also the response from the audience. But importantly, I don't think it's a case of just financial services learning from other industries. I think it's two-way. Mm-hmm. And I wouldn't hold up any of the industries I've worked in, which are utility-like industries, as having found that perfect solution. So it is two-way learning. And for me, they're all basically trying to deal with the same problem, which is how do you maintain resilience, which is really important for consumers, but at the same time maintain customer focus and keep resilience without sort of losing that customer focus and losing other things that consumers value from the service.
Philip?
Absolutely agree. I think we can learn lessons from many industries. What I would say, to reinforce Hannah's comment, is that I don't think there's any industries particularly that stand out. I think it's in organisations within industries that we should look at to learn lessons from. There are better organisations in certain industries. Having said that, I think we're going to discuss later some of the industries that may be better than others in that context.
Well, let's go straight on to that question. And I'll keep with you if you don't mind. Which industries or which areas, because I don't think the military is an industry, although there's defence, which industries should the financial industry be looking at most and why?
I think we're going to cover them, to be honest with you. I think aviation is one of the areas that there's a very good quote from aviation that talks about, don't talk to me about the cost of safety, talk to me about the cost of failure. So actually the business impact of failure is something that we need to understand in the context of resiliency. And therefore, aviation has taken that to heart because obviously they're putting passengers at risk every time they take off. So they have a very resilient environment. I think the training, particularly in the aviation industry, is very interesting. The cockpit, the retraining, the testing of pilots is something that we could learn from. Ensuring that people are qualified, validated before being able to perform their task. The ability to use procedures, documented procedures in a crisis, not just something that we write up and put on the shelf, but actually use them in a crisis is interesting from the aviation industry. And I think John is going to talk later around the visualization of data. If you look at a cockpit 15 or 10 years ago to today, it's a very different environment. Visualization of data, color-coded information, filtering of information to allow the pilot to understand what the real critical problem is at any given time. So aviation is one. Military, I think we look at military a lot from an IBM perspective, primarily from the training perspective. Muscle memory is a phrase we like to use. So the training they have, so in a crisis, in a panic mode, people react in a certain way that can be predictable, which I think is important, combined with a planning. And I think this is a much underestimated area. A lot of people do contingency planning, they do their planning around disaster recovery, etc. But planning and testing of those plans is something, in our experience, that all industries could most probably improve on. Planning, I think the military most probably does the best, and that's an area that we could particularly focus on from the financial services sector. Particularly long-term disaster recovery planning. Most organisations we meet are very good at a relatively, an outage for a few days or maybe a week or so, but a 6-month outage is quite significant. And most organisations, frankly, we meet are either unprepared or they're unrealistic in their expectations of their resolution for such an area. I'll just chuck in a couple of others, sorry to...
Well, you've got to leave some industries for the other two, otherwise it's not fair. Is that all right? If they don't raise them, then you can, but otherwise I feel that...
No worries.
But, John, sorry.
So, let me build on the aviation and aerospace industry learning. So, prior to 2012, CLS primarily monitored for things going wrong, and we had mechanisms and processes and people that were geared to reacting to a failure. In 2012, we shifted our focus, and a big driver of that was the way the aviation and aerospace industry treats data and turns it into information. So we'd always been very reactive. What we learned from the aviation and aerospace industry was that you can use information more powerfully to make you proactive. So in 2012 and 13, we introduced something called the information wall. And if you want to draw parallels, slightly grandiose, but if you've seen the film Apollo 13 and the NASA command center, you can envisage the information panel on the wall. We've got something similar, but on a smaller scale. What we did was analyze actual performance of our members and the marketplace over 2 years. So we looked at input performance, we looked at pay-in performance, we looked at amend and rescind performance, and we determined from that what normal looked like. And then we introduced a set of parameters and alerting mechanisms on the info wall that highlighted when normal wasn't adhered to. So we have an info wall in our command center now that shows us abnormal behavior. And the premise of that is that abnormal might be indicative of a problem and might enable us to preempt the problem or deal with the problem in a much more efficient, proactive and expeditious way. So we've moved from a very reactive model to a very proactive, preemptive model that analyzes past performance to calibrate what normal looks like and therefore tell us what abnormal looks like. And if I draw a slight link into the whole cyber security debate, we've wrestled like any industry with how do you prevent it and how do you recover from it? Well, I think we've all figured out you can't prevent it. These people are too smart, they're too well motivated, too incentivized, etc. You can recover from it, but the most powerful tool at your disposal is really detection. And we think a really good indication of potential cyber threat is abnormal behavior. And we found the info wall to be a powerful asset in that regard.
Hannah.
Excuse me, I'd point to the energy industry because that's the industry, in my experience, that's got most relevance here. And in both energy and in payment systems, I've been at the economic regulator, which puts me in a different position. Because at the regulator, you're not delivering resilience, and you're also not setting the standards for resilience. What you're trying to do is really promote competition and innovation in the interests of consumers, which means, of course, that you have to have regard to resilience. It's not in the consumer interest to push things so far that resilience starts to fall away. And in both energy and in payments, I think often it seems a tension between resilience and what the economic regulator is trying to do. Well, actually, I don't think that's always the case, and I think they can be mutually reinforcing. So innovation can help resilience, as can competition. So it's really trying to find that balance of where the two can work together. And I think another similarity between the two industries is that it's about sort of changing mindsets. So energy networks, which is the part I regulated and Ofgem directly regulates, fast-changing industry now. Wasn't for decades, but actually, with smart technology, with electric vehicles, with people using electricity for space heating and so on, that what we're looking for from our energy networks is really changing. And that means that they're having to adapt to technology, focus on their customers in a way they just didn't have to for decades before. And I think there are parallels there in payments, where actually payment systems are now really fast-moving. Not a week goes by without a new announcement of something exciting happening in the industry, which means the systems really need to focus on what their customers need to move quickly with technology. So the challenges are the same there, I think, is how do you keep up with that? How do you deliver for customers whilst maintaining the resilience in the system?
Thank you. Did we cover all your industries?
Just one I'd like to add, if you don't mind,
No.
Asha. Formula One. Whether it's an industry or not is a debatable point, but I think from the industry perspective, from the low latency world, high frequency trading, we looked at Formula One around every single component being important in the low latency world. I think another lesson we can learn is... And
in a Formula One car as well?
In the Formula One, every single element of the racetrack is reviewed, the car, the brakes, the tyre pressure, everything in terms of low latency to get the car to perform. But in the context of resiliency, I think, building on John's point, the real-time analysis of data from the cockpit, from the car in a race, to be able to quarantine a component, to nurse a car home, understand with some predictive analytics around when a particular part may fail, and therefore take remediation action, is something that we could learn, because the Formula One world has done that, I think, exceptionally well in terms of how they take real-time data, analyse it, predictive analytics, and therefore try and make their cars as resilient as possible.
So the driver's doing that as he's driving?
Well, the team back at the factory is also doing that, relaying it to the pit wall, to the driver, so it's a whole seamless organisation. So it's building on John's sort of, I think the IBM phrase is an enterprise command centre. So actually having an enterprise command centre monitoring actively, proactively monitoring information. I think the Formula One world does that exceptionally well in the real-time kind of performance requirements around Formula One, which is obviously split seconds make differences, etc. So I think that's an industry that we don't normally look at.
Well, it's certainly a surprise to me.
High frequency trading and now the resiliency piece, I'm beginning to draw some parallels.
Good. In the audience, if you do have questions or you want to add to the discussion, please just raise your hand and a microphone will be brought to you at a juncture. Do any of you have any other industries to add or environments to add to the discussion that you think that the FMI industry should be taking lessons from? No? Good. Okay. Well, let's continue. I think we, in that discussion there, we talked about learning about planning, competition, innovation, data, preparedness, being proactive and monitoring. Are there other elements that we could be looking at? Training, for instance. I mean, to what extent does the military training, could that be applied positively in this context? John?
So it's a great example. We've actually recruited from the military. One of the guys on my night shift in New York, who is part of the team that runs the main settlement service, he spent 5 years in the military on the front line with the US Army. What they bring is extraordinary preparation and planning on a level that you might imagine is to do with people living and dying. So it's pretty catastrophic, and I don't want to draw parallels between what they do and what we do in the financial sector, but it's that preparedness, it's that precision of execution. I'm of the school increasingly that what we do in our industry, in the financial market infrastructure industry, is execute process really well. It has to be executed 100% every day. Failure isn't an option. You don't necessarily need people from the financial sector to operate those processes. You just need good process engineers, and the military are really good at process execution, planning and preparedness. They have something called an AAR, after action review, whereby they review every engagement, every foray into the field, and they review what worked, what didn't, what they could do better to plan for the future. So they just bring a really strong execution focus and planning and readiness focus. So it's something we've decided we will continue to pursue to the extent there's opportunities to recruit from the military going forward. But as I say, we have someone in situ now who's proven to be a real asset.
Mm-hmm. And Philip, do you see other industries recruit from the military intentionally for this particular purpose?
To be honest with you, I don't know whether other industries specifically target the military for the resiliency area, but I suggest it's a very strong recommendation that they should do so, reinforcing John's points. I think that they do an exceptional job on planning, and in addition to that, making sure in the chain of command, every single person in that chain of command understands the objective and what's to be achieved, because typically in a crisis your key resources aren't necessarily there. Now in the military that means they've most probably been shot, but in our world they're on holiday, they're sick or some other challenge. So actually having a lower level capability or knowledge of what's required within an organisation is critical. So I absolutely recommend that people should look at the military and recruit from that. I mean, I can't give you any data points, to be honest with you, but I think it's an area that people should focus on.
Mm-hmm. And let's talk about information, so expertise sharing across these industries. Obviously, you can recruit from them. One so far. I think it was Citibank that went through a period of particularly recruiting from the military for their operations department. I think it was their foreign exchange operations department, and then they went to the utilities sector. And I used to work formerly at LCH ClearNet, and the head of LCH ClearNet at that time came from the British coal industry. And part of the reason that he'd been selected by Citibank to work in the operations department was because he'd been working in the coal mines at the time that they'd been shut down. So he was dealing with extreme operational issues at the time, very significant strikes and shutdowns and so forth. So that was an unusual one. But let's talk about expertise sharing. Do you see this, Philip? Do you see industries getting together and sharing the expertise?
I think it's a trend, to be honest with you. From an IBM perspective, we run shared data center monitoring environment, so we look across industries. We're not industry specific because monitoring a server is monitoring a server, so we don't necessarily align by industry in that perspective. But yes, I mean, I think sharing of information is critical. I mean, I think we're seeing that in cybersecurity. Cyber operations centres are a vogue phrase. Sharing of information across governments, military organisations is something that we're seeing. And I can see that trend being very applicable to resiliency as well, because some of the challenges we see shared, a challenge around a particular issue in the resiliency world, such as predictive analytics around server failure, you'll get better data if you share across industries. If you have the more sample size you have, it's a truism. The more sample sizes you have, the better, more accurate the answer will be. So I think there's a definite opportunity to share information. It's a trend I would certainly encourage.
Philip, John, do you agree with that? And there are some criticisms that there isn't enough information sharing just on the cyber issue alone within the financial industry itself, and to a large extent there aren't formalised information sharing mechanisms. So that although there are efforts in different countries and different parts of the industry, and do your members or do your users share information with you on the cyber side, for instance?
No, I mean they have to. Is the short answer? They have to prove a level of capability, both initial and ongoing, and cyber risk mitigation is a key part of that. So to that extent, they'll share with us their level of preparedness and monitoring capability and detection and recovery capability. I do think there's more of a role for information sharing across industries. In a CLS context, we don't currently. But we do sit on a number of infrastructure groups, central banks, RTGS system operators, other FMUs, where there is a lot of cross-sharing of operational learnings with respect to resilience. And there's certainly an awful lot of focus on cyber resilience. I belong to a group that's made up of predominantly central banks, and we spend a a disproportionate amount, but probably the appropriate amount of our time looking at cyber and how we can be better prepared for it as an industry. So I think there's absolutely a role for it. There probably needs to be more of it because we're all trying to solve for the same thing. And I think we've all got things that we can learn from each other.
Can I just sticking with you and sticking with that for the moment? When you say that you do gather together with the central banks in particular and discuss these things, and the information sharing, are we talking more about resilience in terms of protection or resilience in terms of recovery?
So it's actually all of it. It's prevention, it's detection, and it's recovery. But I'll come back to my earlier point. You can be chasing your tail forever trying to prevent it. These people are too smart, too motivated. So you need to put a disproportionate amount of focus on, I think, detection and then recovery. I would say the most amount of focus of time at the moment is on recovery regimes, and that's about how you identify the problem, how you analyse the problem, isolate it, collaborate to figure out the best way to deal with it, share information with those in the ecosystem, and come together quickly with an industry recovery plan. There's certainly a lot of focus on recovery. I think we're all doing lots around prevention, but it's a little bit of a thankless task, I think, in reality. So I think detection and recovery is where the emphasis ought to be. It's certainly where a lot of our emphasis is.
Hannah, can I turn to you on the competition question? On the one hand, competition between two CLSs, for instance, would give one substitutability and therefore the sector greater resilience. On the other hand, competition between two CLSs, were that to be the case, could also lead to a race to the bottom because they need to compete with each other and therefore they can't invest. How do you see this balance on the competition side? And to what extent do you think the regulators, not necessarily the PSR, should be involved?
It's a good question, and we have a statutory duty to promote competition in payment systems. So the first question is, well, what kind of competition are you trying to promote as a regulator? And we're very clear we're definitely trying to promote competition at the consumer end, so in these sort of consumer-facing gadgets and applications that we see. There's a role for us in making sure that the payment systems facilitate and enable that. They're not going to deliver that competition at the end of the supply chain themselves, but they can certainly make sure they're not the blocker and they're an enabler. And the same goes for retail banking. So the payment systems have been cited historically as a big blocker to retail banking competition in the UK. And one of the things we're trying to do is make sure that's not the case going forward. But there are open questions still for us about the extent to which this sort of infrastructure can and should compete. And we're doing a study at the moment really to assess, what are those competitive dynamics now, also what could they be in the future. With technology changing so rapidly as it is at the moment, the answer tomorrow might be very different to the answer to that question today. So that's something we're looking at. And there's also an open question for us about the sort of schemes and to what extent they compete. So, for example, in the UK, we have CHAPS, the high value scheme. To what extent can that or should that compete against, say, BACS or the faster payments scheme? And again, it's an open question for us. So that's work we're doing at the moment. We are only 6 months old, so this is still a work in progress. But those are big questions for the regulator.
Now, you work with financial infrastructures, all sorts, I think central counterparties, exchanges. To what extent do you see them? Now, those markets have become really much more competitive, not in all parts of all countries equally or all sectors equally, but there's certainly more competition, I think, today than there was 15 or 20 years ago. To what extent do you see that competition leading to less investment in resilience or not?
I think, to be honest with you, the challenge is less investment. As people become competitive and the industry is going through a particularly challenging time at the moment in terms of cost management, etc., margins declining, then there is a challenge in how much do you invest in resiliency. Now, John's mentioned a very good point around cyber security. That's clearly taking a significant investment. Is that drawn from the existing pot of money, or is there additional money available? And the problem is the resiliency is critical. And again, to reinforce John's point around resiliency, we should expect failure. I think our perspective is we should expect failure. We live in a very complex world with very complex environments. Doesn't diminish the fact that you should invest significantly in trying to be as resilient as possible, but actually you should expect failure, and actually it's how you recover and the procedures you have around recovery distinguish you from others in other industries. So I think the competition is potentially damaging. Having said that, on the flip side, the very real-world example, the New York Stock Exchange had a major outage, I think in February this year, and actually it was not a major issue. Frankly, because they only do 20% of US equities now on the New York Stock Exchange, a number of other venues, 16 or so venues, where you can trade those equities, and therefore the market could just transition to the other venues and execute appropriately. So that's an example where competition has actually alleviated the resiliency issue and challenge. So I think that's both sides of the coin to some extent. One, if you have competition, it helps, but if there's alternative venues available to continue transactions, competition on the cost side is clearly a concern. And I think as budgets become under pressure, that's a major issue. And what we see is, frankly, IT organisations making some of the budgetary decisions, purely because they're used to the fact that there's a budgetary constraint, and therefore they're making that decision themselves that, we won't invest X in improving our resiliency. And actually that should be a business decision, understanding the business impact analysis and making the business decide that they're willing to put up with that impact if that is a failure or a problem, by not investing, not duplicating something, whatever the right answer is. So it's a conversation we're constantly having with the organisations around actually
so those cyber protection investment decisions are being made in the IT departments themselves, not at executive level or at management, at board level?
No, my answer was around resiliency, purely the resiliency, the recovery and incident protection. Cyber security, I suggest, is certainly surfacing at the board level. It's a topic that, when we go through our issues and challenges with a number of participants in the marketplace, they say they understand and agree with everything we say. They get 10 of the points, but the one that really scares them is cyber security, because it's a bottomless pit to some example, for an example, and the challenge is who knows where the next threat's coming from. So it actually scares organisations and therefore getting board attention. So I think it's coming from the top, not bottom up.
John?
Yeah, just to build on that, if I may. So our board's meeting in Singapore this week, but at every board meeting now there is a cyber security briefing. More specifically, there's a broad briefing on security, including a fairly detailed suite of metrics that the board get presented. So just to your point, it's getting a lot of attention at a very senior level. It's not just the domain of the chief security officer and technology, it's the responsibility of the board and the committees that underpin that board. So it gets a lot of attention at a board level within CLS, and I would suggest probably within other institutions also.
And what about from your, do you call them users or members?
Clients, members, users, whatever works for you.
How much attention, how much focus do they, how much do they question your resilience? And they're very dependent on you for what they use you for. How much pressure do you see from them?
Yeah, so
or interest?
Hannah had made a point offline about competition being a healthy thing, but more importantly, resilience being a key differentiator. And I think it absolutely is. I think if you ask people what they value most about the CLS brand, it's resilient. It's the fact that we perform every day and we do what we're supposed to do. But that requires a lot of thoughtful planning. And sorry, I've lost. What was your first? What was the question?
To what extent do you?
Oh, to the members. Yeah. So the members absolutely are interested in how we're approaching resilience more broadly, but specifically cyber risk. But I come back to the age-old challenge of running a privately owned utility that's set up for public good. We are heavily regulated. We were set up to address systemic risk in the foreign exchange market. It's a difficult balance to strive between running a privately funded entity that spends an appropriate amount on resilience and demonstrates value for money versus meeting the regulatory and market expectations of resilience and performance that underpin what we do every day. I think we strike that balance pretty well, but it's a constant. They're not good bedfellows, if I can put it that way, and the board spends a lot of time in that regard.
But you're not profit maximisers, CLS.
We're not. It's a cost plus model. So we generate enough revenue to cover our costs and to invest for the future. So we're not looking to make as much money as we can. We're looking to be appropriately financially prudent. Our shareholders are our owners and our users. It's an unusual model, but it's not shareholder value in the traditional sense of, there's a dividend or there's some financial return. It's all about the quality of the service that we provide to them.
Yeah, so I mean, there are those that would argue that you're in less of a difficult position in that sense than a profit, a listed profit maximizer in a very competitive part of the financial markets.
I think that's probably right. We're probably, with respect, not incentivized in the way that perhaps other industries and organisations are.
How are those dealing with it, Philip? If I can turn to you, seeing as these are your clients, these red meat-eating non-utility market infrastructures. How do they deal with, on the one hand, the investor's appetite for return, and on the other hand, their clients' users' dependencies on them, and let's face it, the very central role that they play in whatever part of the industry they're active in?
I mean, I think it's a significant challenge. As we mentioned, the cost pressure, the margin challenge is there for the organisations, but by the same token, they have the reputational risk in a number of countries, the financial centre itself. So any outage, any issues are effectively, very rapidly taken to the very top within a particular country, the regulator, maybe government, etc. And therefore, that reputational damage can be very significant to a financial centre. So they are, challenged with the investing in resiliency, and I think it's the law of diminishing returns, that you can continue to invest in resiliency, and the level of improvements obviously declines as you go through that curve. So they have to draw the line somewhere where they're willing to invest from a for-profit organisation, but also taking on board the fact that they are a very systemically important organisation in a number of occasions. What we do see is interesting. A number of organisations refer to us as, we're not that large an organisation. We can't invest in a very nice enterprise command centre with 24/7 staff, etc. You wouldn't expect it of an organisation of our size. Well, frankly, that might be true. But on the other hand, you are a systemically important organisation, if not listed, almost de facto, and therefore you most probably do need to invest, and you actually have to ensure that you are resilient and you have that capability, because the reputational damage to you, and that can come in, that can either come in significant regulatory fines through failure, or it can actually mean that the market is opened up to your detriment because people want to encourage competition because they see you not performing. So I think organisations have to take it on board, but it's not an easy decision.
Do you think it would be easier or better, one or the other, for this to be regulated in certain sectors of and we've seen it in some sectors of the FMI industry, not necessarily all of them, and not necessarily in the same way?
Well, my first phrase would be delegation isn't abdication. So, I wouldn't want the regulators to be seen as the get out a jail free card for a number of organisations in terms of I'm meeting the regulatory standards, therefore I'm meeting my needs.
Yeah.
Because that stifles innovation and ability to differentiate yourself. But we've seen it in the US with the SEI regulation. They've actually regulated against resiliency in the US quite significantly. We're seeing papers from IOSCO coming out and saying the same thing. So there is an element of regulation coming through the global marketplace, if not in specific countries already. And that regulation is I suggest welcome, because it gives a benchmark, a standard. But organisations should also look at that and see how they can improve. And to John's point earlier, there is a competitive advantage in being more resilient than others. Actually, if you are the most resilient organisation particularly in a competitive environment, then obviously it can differentiate you. So there is that element that you can actually stand out from your competition by being more resilient and more robust, or a better recovery than others.
Mm-hmm. In some more than others. I mean, if you're using both two different CEFs or two different exchanges, I can use the one that's less resilient most of the time because it's cheaper, and when it goes down, I turn my tubes to the other one.
Absolutely, that is a challenge, and that's it's similar to surveillance, to be honest with you. Surveillance is a cost; it's not a revenue generator. So how much do you invest in surveillance? Because it's actually something you just have to do as probably regulating your market. It's not something where you can significantly differentiate yourself. Same for resiliency, as you rightly point out, that I can be the most resilient organisation, but I'm there as the backstop for the the organisations that haven't invested appropriately to be so resilient, and therefore that is one of the issues. But I think regulation there helps because it sets a benchmark, a baseline,
minimum,
of which people have to get to. And certainly from my view of the SCI regulations, it's a pretty strong baseline. It's a pretty good baseline for the starting point. to make sure every organisation meets that bare minimum standard.
Hannah, do you have anything to add to this?
I wanted to come back to this point about the relationship between the infrastructure and its members, because this is something that's really important from the UK payment systems regulator's point of view, because the payment systems that we regulate are the systemically important ones, and they're all owned by their biggest users, who are basically the biggest financial institutions in the UK. And so that relationship between the members and the infrastructure provider is absolutely crucial. One of the things we've been really trying to do at the regulator is raise the level of conversation in the members' organisations, because there's a sort of feeling, and I exaggerate to make the point, that those member organisations generally saw the payment systems as a cost centre, as something that they could just leave alone as long as they didn't fall over. Whereas actually in a rapidly changing environment, which is the one we're moving into now in payment systems, that's not really good enough anymore, and we need to have those payment systems seen as the strategic asset they are, because after all they underpin a lot of the services that those financial institutions provide. So raising that level of debate in the member organisations, which means then they're more engaged with the infrastructure provider themselves and really driving the direction and the functionality from the infrastructure, I think is really important.
And they should be, really.
Yeah, indeed, yeah.
They should be. Okay, I haven't had any questions from you. Am I going to see any questions? Yes, super. We have one here in the front row. If you can bring up a microphone, please. Could I ask you to just briefly introduce yourself so we have some context? Thank you.
David Brown, Reserve Bank of Australia. It's probably a question more for John. In terms of recovery from a cyber attack, are you looking at non-similar facilities?
It's a great question. So very topical discussion at the moment. Third sites, non-similar facilities. Interestingly enough, we have a discussion with our board this week about the concept of a non-similar facility. We happen to be building another platform actually right now that's designed to enable us to launch another service in due course alongside our main settlement service. We are very much thinking about that as being a potential non-similar facility. It will sit in our own data centres. It's a different line of code. It will sit on different infrastructure, but it will have the ability, at least the goal is for it to have the ability to pick up from either a catastrophic data centre failure, a code failure, or a data failure. And you can imagine one of the challenges with that is how do you feed it data, and how often do you feed it data, and at what point do you recover from? So that's some of the low-level detail we're working through, but short answer, along with many other, I think FMUs, particularly RTGSs, I think MERS for the Bank of England is a good example of a non-similar facility. It's very much in our thoughts as a robust response to not only a catastrophic data centre failure, but perhaps more topically now, a cyber event of some kind.
Thank you. Any other questions? Can I ask you how many of you are customers of FMIs? One.
Wow.
Gosh. So I think the balance must be either just interested parties or regulators. How many are regulators or overseers of some kind? Not very many. Well, I'd be fascinated to know what the balance
Where
are.
are the rest of them from? Yeah.
Okay. We talked a bit about people, but not very much. I wanted to explore a bit the role that people and culture, organisational culture, have in resiliency. And I think here we're talking probably more about the recovery than the protection, perhaps. But I think when I think of the military, so I've not been very exposed to it for one reason or another, but there's a very solid chain of command, and within that, particularly as one sort of reaches down, there's no questioning. There's an order and you follow it. To what extent is that actually really replicable in the environment in which you operate, we operate? I would question. Because do you actually need people to question or to obey orders in extreme scenarios?
Shall I
Go on then.
take that to get the ball rolling? So absolutely in a crisis, you want people to understand their roles, responsibilities. Chain of command's important. It's important that everyone knows what their role in a crisis is. But equally, we've tried to create an environment over the last few years in CLS around what we call our operational excellence strategy, and that's essentially creating a group of process engineers that think for themselves and challenge the age-old way of doing things. So what you don't want necessarily is someone to challenge the process in a crisis, but you do want someone sometimes to challenge the way you're thinking about the problem, how to recover from it, how to message it, etc. So we've tried to create an environment where people absolutely understand their role, and we have a very mature, established crisis management framework, but also hopefully we've encouraged them to feel comfortable to speak up if they see something glaringly wrong in what we're doing, or they've got an idea that might expedite recovery or whatever, but they feel they're able to speak up and contribute. What you don't want is frankly, a bunch of automatons that just do what they're told and programmed to do. We're trying to create an environment of thinkers and innovators and people who feel confident that they're in a safe environment where they can challenge, and we continue along that journey of maturing the workforce to that extent.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, just to reinforce John's points, I mean, I think personally from our perspective, we believe in process, not unsurprisingly coming from an organisation like IBM, but process in a crisis, roles and responsibilities, chain of command are absolutely important. Understanding what you're expected to do in any given crisis is very critical. Communication, both internal and external, communication is very critical, particularly in our industry in terms of external communication. But internal communication is often challenging, particularly as we move to remote sites, two centres, maybe 3 centres. That communication is absolutely critical. The industry is also full of what I would describe as firefighters, some great guys in IT operations.
And girls.
And girls, sorry, yes, absolutely. Firefighters, I'll use it. Firefighters are very good at getting in, sleeves rolled up and resolving an issue and a challenge. Now, in a crisis that may work. The challenge is that acting independently in a very robust way may mean that they're taking risks that maybe they're aware of, but the rest of the organisation isn't. Maybe the senior or executive management isn't aware that they're taking a particular risk. They just think that they're doing the right thing, and they don't fully understand the risk they're taking in any recovery process. So that is a challenge, I suggest, is that the people that we employ typically in the industry, because of the way it's grown up and worked, relies very heavily on firefighters, but in a crisis you actually want people that are more communicative and also ability to work across a process in the chain of command.
Talk to me about the role of accreditation, the role that plays in your processes.
Yes, so this builds on our operational excellence programme. So along the lines of the theme of creating a bunch of process experts and engineers, and this is to some extent leveraging a little bit how the air traffic control industry works. This is the idea of a constant accreditation process. So each of my team has to be accredited to run the service, and there are degrees of accreditation which determine how much responsibility and authority you've got. And the value of that is that we can say with confidence, what the ability of the individuals within the team are and what they're capable of doing. Where it really comes into play is where someone's out either for protracted sickness or protracted leave, or it might be a lady on maternity leave, it could be a new starter, it could be someone who's changed position, but we have a process for reintegrating them into the operational environment where they have to get re-accredited, and until they're re-accredited, then we ring-fence them to some extent in terms of the role that they can play.
What does that, it varies per person, but can you give us an example of what the accreditation might involve?
So accreditation right now is multifaceted, but we have a lot of online learning capability, e-learning. So there's a series of tests, modules that each operator has to complete and achieve a certain success rate in. We do desktop scenarios. I hate the term war games, but that's essentially what they are. Desktop exercises around planning for the what if, and there's a process for evaluating their performance in that context. So all our crisis leads and crisis management team have to go through an accreditation process to be part of the crisis management framework. So that's to prove that they know their subject, they know how the system works, they know the operational timeline, they know the tools at our disposal. So, but where it's powerful from an operator standpoint is it really forces you to invest in the people. It really forces you to invest in training and development and exploring, their potential and exploiting their potential. So it's quite a rewarding exercise, albeit it's regimented and it's designed to ensure that we don't have non-accredited people doing things that they're not necessarily accredited to do.
Okay. I'd like to go back to the role that collaboration and that sort of thing should play within the financial services industry. And I believe that in the UK there were a couple of Bank of England-led scenarios, Dying Swan and Rising Shark or similar exciting names like this. So the bank has organised those, and I think they've been sort of cross-industry. But one could question whether two in a year is actually sufficient. Maybe there were more, I don't know, but there were certainly two that became public. Should the industry itself, Hannah, do you think, especially given the many interdependencies between the different systems and players, should the industry actively be working together to play out these scenarios?
I think that's a good question, and I suppose the answer is almost certainly yes. The scenarios you mentioned, I don't know a huge amount about, and certainly with my Bank of England colleagues in the room, I'm not going to pretend that I do know a huge amount about them. But this idea of collaboration is an important one from a regulatory point of view as well, and not just in terms of resilience, but in terms of innovation more widely. Because payment systems and financial services more generally are heavily networked, which means that there's often no point just one bank doing something, because those systems need to be able to talk to other bank systems in the UK, but also internationally too. And so from a regulatory point of view, there's a big question around where is the boundary between competition and collaboration. And so our approach at the payment systems regulator is very much to sort of do a test that says, if the innovation can be delivered commercially and competitively, then our role is effectively to get out of the way and let the market do its job. There may be some barriers to competition that we can help remove, but otherwise we get out of the way. But where that's not the case, because of the network effects, you need the industry to move together. Then our role is really to help the industry move together and provide that momentum. So good examples in the UK recently would be the faster payments scheme, which is a near real-time payment system, which was delivered collaboratively, as was the current account switch service, which enables consumers to switch between current accounts easily and effectively. And those things have to be delivered collaboratively because all the systems need to talk together. But also those sorts of collaborative innovation have historically been very slow to take place, have only really happened with government prompting. And so what we're trying to do is really provide some natural momentum into the system so that the government doesn't need to step in, but the industry can take things forward itself, which is why we've launched our Payment Strategy Forum, which is really bringing industry together. And I mean industry in the widest sense. So it's not just the financial institutions, the payment systems, it's also the users. So it's the retailers, it's the end consumer, it's the innovators, bringing all those people together to work out what needs to be done and then provide momentum in delivering that.
Thank you. Does the Bank of England want to comment? No? Let's put you on the spot. Philip.
Well, I'll just add around the testing. I mean, I think we can always do more testing. And I mean, the challenge for the industry is typically, certainly in the environment I'm familiar with, it's out of hours testing, so it's weekend testing. And there's only so many times so many weekends in the year that you can actually perform testing, and there's a number of other activities that have to take place during that time as well. So a number of organisations we look at are very good at testing between the production and their disaster recovery centre, and sometimes even running from the disaster recovery centre for a period of time and switching back and forth. What they tend not to test very often is intraday failure. Switching over intraday when you've had a major outage. It's a significant challenge to test. It's not easy to test because you're putting your entire organisation at risk potentially for a test scenario. But that's something that organisations do need to test more than they do today, and in a more real-world experience, I suggest. And that's maybe where, I don't know whether we're coming onto that, but technology can maybe assist, because we talked about aviation and the flight simulator for the pilot, etc. Developing a simulation environment where, in effect, it allows us to test more rigorously some of the things we'd like to test but don't have the time or the capabilities without putting our organisation at risk, could allow us to do going forward. So I think, for me, that's an area we could certainly certainly focus on. It's the biggest gap I suggest we see is not in technology resiliency, it's in the recovery plans and the amount of testing that we see organisations do. That's the biggest gap that we see across a number of industries.
Really? Across other industries as well?
There is no standout industry. Some organisations do it better, but that is typically where gaps appear.
And when you talk about the testing that you do see, particularly in the FMI world, if I can, I mean, do you see them doing it sort of in their own world or with their users?
Typically within their own world, although the SCI regulations in the US have now mandated at least once a year that they test with their industry participants, the member firms or the brokerage firms, etc. And again, that's absolutely critical. It's one of the challenges in our industry is that an exchange or a CSD can absolutely be resilient and recover from an incident, but actually they're inherently reliant on their member firms. A couple of examples, high frequency trading, for example, with co-location isn't typically replicated for cost reasons in the disaster recovery centre. Now, I think everybody knows in the room that significant revenues and transactions come from that space today, and therefore the decision to move to the disaster recovery centre is disintermediating those participants immediately. Now, they've got alternatives.
Potentially the biggest ones.
The biggest ones, and the revenue, frankly, from the exchange perspective, they could switch and they can connect and they can trade, but they can't, they're not performing in their normal manner, etc.
So they might withdraw all liquidity.
So liquidity is a challenge. So then you get into the question of, are you operating a fair and orderly, transparent market if you've just lost 60% of your liquidity? So there are a lot of other challenges in those decisions that to migrate across. So I think the challenge is there. And it's something that we need to focus on and try and test more, frankly. And again, those decisions are complex and there's no easy answer.
And what about cross-industry testing? So, for instance, a major energy outage in a given country or a major terrorist attack wouldn't just have effect on, say, you, well, hopefully not you, but, your ability to function from your primary site, let's say, and also the financial industry itself, if one was talking about the City of London. But it could be causal of all sorts of other problems as well, inability to travel, much bigger. Have you been part of much wider scenario tests?
So industry exercises are really powerful. We've participated.
But this is cross-industry, so
yeah,
could be a sort of terrorism scenario in which all transportation has ceased, in which, I don't know, energy and water supplies might have been disrupted.
So I don't know if this gets to your point, but we think about that in the context of regional resilience. So the way to mitigate that is you have your data centres in different geographies, you have your command centres in different geographies. That doesn't prevent the risk of a very targeted attack on all locations, and that's not beyond the realms of possibility, but you try and diversify as much as possible your people, your power. Your location strategy is geared around a regionally resilient model. But, there's, back to the cost, there's how far do you go? Discussions about third site, third operating centre, non-similar facilities, it's all adding costs to the industry. In the interest of planning for those what-if scenarios. And if I can just make a point related to that, and this is a personal perspective, not a CLS perspective, I think resilience and cybersecurity is costing the industry a fortune right now. And I think it's because we're all spending to some extent in silos. If you look at the major banks, for example, they all have stakes in various settlement platforms, infrastructures, trading platforms, etc. We're all doing the same thing to mitigate these risks. We're all using similar infrastructure but different. We're all thinking about cyber security. We're all thinking about what we can do for resilience. And I know this gets against competition, so hence it's my view rather than necessarily a CLS view. But there's got to be some opportunity for greater collaboration across the industry to mitigate that cost. We can't keep spending individually in silos within regions. There's got to be an opportunity for more shared infrastructure, shared learning, shared cyber security detection and response, etc. We're a long way off that yet, but I bet if you look at other industries, there's been probably a lot more consolidation and rationalisation and sharing than there perhaps has been in the financial sector.
Mm-hmm. Of course, you can have sharing without necessarily the concentration. And just being at Cybos and being from Swift, sorry, I have to plug Cybos itself. You're here to connect and to collaborate. So what better place to do it than here? Even if there aren't many FMIs in the room, perhaps you can collaborate and connect with them downstairs. I'm going to. Oh, we have a question. Super. Up at the front, please. If you can please announce yourself first.
Not to me though, Mike.
Morning, John. Good morning, Mike Zetmar, IBM. I just want to expand on a question that John sort of alluded to, which is the financial market and services is at the most integrated it has been in history, and we're becoming more integrated. If you define a resilient system as something that's able to respond, it's able to learn, it's able to monitor, and to anticipate, the question we haven't asked is whose responsibility is it to start understanding FMI in its entirety across jurisdictions, across the FMIs, and actually start driving some of the testing, the understanding, the sharing of knowledge, the sharing of best practice? Because we haven't answered that question. I think that's really important for us to understand.
Is anyone from DTCC here? Because I believe DTCC is about to publish a report about interconnectedness and its views on that, and perhaps suggesting more examination of exactly this question. No one from DTCC, well, they'll get punished for non-attendance at the session later. But I think that might be an interesting thing to look at from that perspective. But I think in some cases the central banks or colleges of regulators do look at that, where you have infrastructures operating across jurisdictions. In fact, probably like yourselves, I would imagine your oversight or your regulators, your college, probably do think about exactly that sort of thing. I think certainly in the SWIFT case, that is the case. That's exactly what they're sort of trying to think about. But a wholesale one across the world, goodness me, I'm not sure.
Just to reinforce Mike's point, I think Singapore is actually a quite good example in the cyber security. They actually have an organisation they've created for cyber security across all industries for Singapore. And the Monetary Authority of Singapore is looking obviously at financial services as a subset of that organisation. So I think they're doing a good job in terms of cross-industry sharing of information and trying to ensure that from a country perspective they're protected as best they can and leverage all the assets they have to deliver that. Just one other point on Singapore to some extent, because we're in Singapore, the geographical challenge of third sites and second sites, etc., and power supplies. America has a lot better choices than Singapore does, just because of the geographic size of this country. So they, here has some specific geographical challenges, but from leveraging, cross-sharing of information, I think they've certainly got the right perspective, and they're moving in that direction. And they see, I see that, because I live and work in Singapore more and more in this particular area.
No, but it's a small geography to deal with that. But I think we're seeing some of the market infrastructures actually sort of do secondary sites outside their country, even when their first one is a sizable one like the United States. But I'm not going to plug them because they're not here. Anyway, I do have a final question for you. Oh no, we've got another question up in the front row. There's something about the front row. They're always the best pupils.
Rob Cocklarts at Bottom Line Technologies. An observation, we didn't talk a lot about the energy industry, but if you're on an oil rig, you're probably all aware that they're constantly monitoring with sensors the production of the oil rig, and using algorithms to understand what will break before it does, and then take it out of commission. I'd be interested in seeing whether there's a general view about the industry moving from being reactive to being proactive, and the role of new technology. I mentioned algorithms. We live in the world of the algorithm with Google, etc. But we can look at trends, we can look at patterns, we can work out what's going to break before it maybe does. Would the panel maybe talk a little bit about that and how they see new emerging technology that can make us more efficient to reduce risk?
Thank you.
I'll go first. From an IBM perspective, absolutely. We actually already deploy in our own data centers for ourselves, and where we manage customer data centers, predictive analytics using algorithms around being predictive at potential failures within the environment, and self-learning to some extent. So we're already applying that technology to that space, and it's something we're engaging with customers on in a number of areas, and certainly it's an area of interest for people, because as I think we've been discussing on the panel, prevention and recovery are the key. And obviously if you can start to, predicting challenges in advance and removing components that are potentially or likely to fail purely from a safety perspective, to ensure they don't fail, it's absolutely the correct thing to do. So we see that already happening. We apply it ourselves. So, with the Internet of Things and more sensory devices coming on stream, I suspect that will get better. The data will get better, and therefore the analytics and the predictive analytics will give more insight. So it's certainly an area that we see developing and improving over time.
John, you mentioned this earlier. In fact, I think you're monitoring.
Yeah, but not. I don't. I think the world that's been envisaged is a little more sophisticated relative to where CLS is at right now. But I think directionally, it's the right direction. We're simply using empirical behaviour to inform decisions that might allow us to preempt a problem before it happens. So, we have some indicators on our wall that tell us whether someone's inactive in terms of input, whereas they're normally active. Someone's overactive. Common rescind counterparty, someone's being rescinded against, could be indicative of a credit or insolvency event that's emerging. Slow amends, slow matching can be indicative of someone being off the air or a problem with their pipe. So we are directionally, aspirationally, that's absolutely where we'd like to get. I'm not smart enough to know how algorithms might play a role in that, but I think conceptually I can see it completely, and I think directionally that's certainly where CLS is keen to go. Lead indicators, early warnings, find it, fix it before it happens.
Fix it before it happens. Well, let's end on that note. You've been absolved from the final question because I've been flashed a red card. We're over time. Well, thank you all very much for coming here today, and I'd like to thank John, Hannah and Philip, my three panellists, for such an interesting discussion. Thank you.
Thank you.